Welcome everyone, I'm Dr. Donald Wallenfang, and this live stream is entitled Paul Ricoeur and the Narration of the Sacred. Thinking with Paul Ricoeur about his unique brand of phenomenology and dialogue with classical metaphysics. In this episode, in this session of a live stream, continuing to think about Paul Ricoeur, and we might wonder, is his philosophy a Christian philosophy? Because he's going to dip into thinking about religious experience. He's going to think about God's revelation, and he's going to refer to Jesus of Nazareth. Does this make his philosophy Christian philosophy? I think we can say yes, it does. And he doesn't hide the fact that this is the cultural air he breathes, the ground he walks on in Christianized France in the 20th century. And it's not just because he's raised in the culture that he refers to religious phenomena, but it's also because he's convinced, he believes. He believes. It's not just a religious tradition he inherited. It is that. It is his context. It is, we could say, largely the context of Western philosophy since the time of Jesus. And so he doesn't hide that fact. Paul Ricoeur is all about context. And so he doesn't shy away from or try to neutralize the actual context in which he does his thinking. So we want to think along with him in this live stream about, we could say, the narration of the sacred, the narration of, therefore, religious experience. So in a Christian tonality in which Ricoeur indigenously speaks, the God who is coming is opposed to the God of present manifestation. That's a big difference for Ricoeur compared to other Christian philosophers like Jean-Luc Marion, for example. So Ricoeur opposes the God who is coming, this eschatology, to the God of present manifestation, the God of incarnation, the God of the sacrament. Without denying all of this, Paul Ricoeur is looking toward the eschatological horizon of God's revelation and what we call salvation history. So for the Christian disciple, Ricoeur says, and this is a quote from his book, Conflict of Interpretations, for the Christian disciple, the meaning of the resurrection is in its future, the death of death, the resurrection of all from the dead. The God who is witnessed to is not, therefore, the God who is, but the God who is coming. So this is very characteristic of Ricoeur, of Protestant Christianity in general. There's this anticipation of what is to come with God. And then it enlivens that theological virtue of hope. Hope is very prominent in Paul Ricoeur's, we could say, philosophy of proclamation. To quote further from his book, Conflict of Interpretations, he says, the already of Christ's resurrection orients the not yet of the final recapitulation. But this meaning reaches us disguised by the Greek Christologies, which have made the incarnation the temporal manifestation of eternal being and the eternal present, thus hiding the principal meaning, namely that the God of the promise, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has approached, has been revealed as he who is coming for all. He who is coming, not so much he who is present, but above all for Ricoeur, the God who is coming, a revelation on the way, thus disguised by epiphanic religion, the religion of epiphany, of theophany, of hierophany. God disguised by this and all the associated nearby idols, the resurrection has become the pledge of all divine presence in the present world, cultic presence, mystic presence. The task of a hermeneutics of the resurrection is to reinstitute the potential of hope, to tell the future of the resurrection. So if Ricoeur's philosophy is one of proclamation, it means a word that's proclaimed, that's signifying something on the future horizon, a future advent of God in his revelation, and what we call in Christianity the resurrection. When we talk about the resurrection here on earth, not because if it's already happened to us, but because we hope to enjoy it in the future, in the day to come, after death, after dying. The good news is delivered on the hindsight of death. So Ricoeur is very attuned to this, not as much the kingdom of God and its inbreaking incarnate presence here and now and a sacramental reality, but more so the sacrament that points to the future eschatological rendezvous with destiny. So this is something very different between Ricoeur and Marion. Thus, Ricoeur's hermeneutics of proclamation finds its impetus in an eschatology of the sacred rather than a presence of the sacred or manifestation of the sacred. And so, if we're talking about eschatology of the sacred, this is something that comes by way of narration, by way of testimony. Eschatology, we don't touch immediately and directly in the here and now, but we await um, we await its coming, and we await with hope and anticipation a future, but and not yet participation. Yet for all this, Ricoeur refuses to eschew being. This is where he has a turn to classical metaphysics again. He refuses to be dismissive of classical metaphysics and being. And it is at this point, too, that Ricoeur parts company with Jean-Luc Marion's notion of Dieu sans l'être, God without being, instead opting to honor this struggle with words as presented in biblical texts. So in his book co-authored with André Lacocque, entitled Thinking Biblically, Ricoeur, he disagrees with Marion's concept of God without being. And he says, how does this get us any farther in Christian belief, in Christian philosophy? He disagrees. And at the end, he says, without the pact of the Judeo-Christian with the Hellenistic, Neoplatonic, medieval, Neo-Aristotelianism, without this pact of the whole tradition of interpretation of the kerygma, both theologically, philosophically, culturally, without this pact of it all, declaring themselves totally foreign to Greek thought, identified globally with the metaphysics of being, do Jewish and Christian thoughts not disenculture themselves and consent to their marginalization? So that's the danger in completely detaching philosophy from classical metaphysics within a Christian context. It's a betrayal of the very epistemological, intellectual foundations of this tradition. And Ricoeur is quite concerned if we do that, we actually go backwards in this work. So he does not let go of the Seinsfrage, the question of being, in relation to divine revelation. For Ricoeur, we cannot undo the encounter between sacred texts and the history of their translation, exegesis, interpretation, and enculturation. All the same, Ricoeur is sympathetic with Rudolf Bultmann's project of demythologization, which for Ricoeur would be a moment of critique following first naivete, moving toward a second naivete, and a better understanding of reality. So he's sympathetic with Bultmann's project of demythologization insofar far as it contributes to the necessary stage of critique from that first naivete to second naivete, unmasking cultural accoutrements and mythical adaptations in order to bring the charismatic kernel to the light of understanding, only then to be appropriated in ethical action. So Ricoeur, there'd be something similar between him and Rudolf Bultmann on this point, though he's not Bultmannian per se for sure. So a key essay Ricoeur publishes in the year 1978 entitled Manifestation and Proclamation. So again, taking a lot of the commentary from my 2017 book, Dialectical Anatomy of the Eucharist. But this essay of Ricoeur drove this whole project. So I give credit to him for making this observation concerning universal structures and forms of religious expression. No matter what the religious tradition, what we observe through phenomenology especially is these two primary modes of expression, one called manifestation, the other called proclamation. Ricoeur directly juxtaposes these two notions in order to promote a living dialectic between a hermeneutics of religious language, proclamation, and a phenomenology of the sacred, manifestation. And yet, even though he brings this dialectic into view, he does not hide his bias toward the proclamation pole of the dialectic. In his book, Figuring the Sacred, in which this essay is featured as one of the chapters, Ricoeur writes, in Christianity, there is a polarity between manifestation and proclamation, which Mircea Eliade does not recognize in his homogeneous concept of manifestation, epiphany, and so forth. I wonder, Ricoeur says, whether there is not also in the Hebraic and Christian traditions a polarity of another kind. On one hand, the charismatic, which is linked to language. For us, manifestation is not by necessity linked to language. The word sacred belongs to the side of manifestation, not to the side of proclamation, because many things can be sacred without being a text. Manifestation is not verbal by origin. So the very concept of the sacred is, first of all, non-verbal. It's pre-linguistic. It's this sensation. It's a phenomenon manifest, a power manifest, before it's put into words through interpretation. So Ricoeur admits this, but he goes on to say, but I think that there is something specific in the Hebraic and Christian traditions that gives a kind of privilege to the word. So that's Ricoeur's argument. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, there's a privileging of the word, even though there's much to do with the manifestation of the sacred. But for Ricoeur, this Christianity is primarily phenomenality of word, of speech, of witness, of text, of prophecy, of all of these things in which we have, going back to Moses and Abraham, a living testimony that's handed on. The Torah, the law, the Shema prayer, all of this handed on. And eventually we have this reform movement within Christianity, which in some ways redoubles the textuality of the tradition in terms of making it a translatable message of salvation for the world. So Ricoeur is observing all these things, but he's putting the accent on proclamation over and against manifestation. And in his book, Freud and Philosophy, Ricoeur says, to be sure, I speak of the holy other, divinity, only insofar as it addresses itself to me. And the kerygma, the glad tidings, is precisely that it addresses itself to me and ceases to be the holy other, the numinous, the mysterium fascinans et tremendum. Ricoeur says God grants access to God through this speech act, through this revelation that is entirely linguistic and interpretive. Thereby, it becomes an event of human speech and can be recognized only in the movement of interpretation of this human speech. So that's how Ricoeur understands divine revelation in this way. And if you're listening, if you have any questions, comments, feel free to put them in the chat. I'm keeping watch and happy to entertain any questions and thoughts you have. So we want to continue to think with Ricoeur about religious experience, religious phenomena. And Ricoeur posits that book of Rudolf Otto, The Idea of the Holy, and the work of Mircea Eliade, who also taught at the University of Chicago for years. He presents them as exponents of the phenomenology of the sacred. These thinkers identify those elements in religious experience that are not inscribable within the categories of linguistic proclamation and its ensuing interpretation. So in his book, Interpretation Theory, Ricoeur writes, "We are warned from the very beginning that we are here crossing the threshold of an experience, religious experience, that does not allow itself to be completely inscribed within the categories of logos or proclamation and its transmission or interpretation. The numinous element, that's the sense of the sacred, the overwhelming, overpowering sense of the sacred, is not first a question of language, if it ever really becomes one. For to speak of power is to speak of something other than speech, even if it implies the power of speaking. This power, as efficacity par excellence, is what does not pass over completely into the articulation of meaning." So Ricoeur admits this, but he says, but what have we do to this power if we can't find meaning about it, if we can't articulate it? It's very mysterious, enigmatic, puzzling, but he says that the symbol is that which maintains both linguistic and non-linguistic dimensions. A symbol, he says, always refers its linguistic element to something else. So the symbol is the bridge to the sacred for Ricoeur. It's a necessary bridge. Without the symbol, without the religious symbol, basically he's saying we cannot really access religious experience as such. So the symbol is required. He goes on to talk about Otto and Eliade, these thinkers, Otto's notion of the numinous and the mysterium fascinans et tremendum, the mystery fascinating and tremendous, even terrifying, coupled with Eliade's concept of hierophany, the manifestation of the sacred, assume the form of preverbal manifestation. They are indeed saturating phenomena that are not translatable into language directly, yet nonetheless reveal themselves through types of symbolic discourse such as myth, poetry, music, dance, ritual. Both Otto and Eliade point to a cosmos that is permeated with a translucence of meaning. And so Ricoeur says in his book Interpretation Theory, if no myth narrated how things came to be, or if there were no rituals which reenacted this process, the sacred would remain unmanifested. So the sacred is manifested to the degree that it is interpreted, is presented with meanings correlated with manifestation. Each meaning correlated with a manifest phenomenon, a self-manifesting phenomenon. Without meaning, Ricoeur is saying, no manifestation for subjectivity, just maybe a vague sense of manhu. And it's interesting, in the Hebrew scriptures, the word manna, the bread from heaven, comes from a Hebrew word manhu. That means, what is it? Like, don't know at first. But at least it's translated into manna, some kind of word, some kind of meaning for the givenness of this mysterious bread on the ground found in the morning. So Ricoeur, following the lead of Rudolf Otto and Mircea Eliade, identifies what he sees to be the crux of the manifestation proclamation dialectic. The apparently bound symbolism of the cosmos, in which symbols come to language only to the extent that the elements of the world themselves become transparent. That is, when they allow the transcendent to appear through them. So the chiasm for Ricoeur, to use the language of Merleau-Ponty, the chiasm between this world of the manifestation of the sacred and the proclamation or narration of the sacred is the symbolism of the cosmos itself. First of all, we think of Psalm 19 in the Hebrew scriptures. The heavens declare the glory of God. The sky proclaims its builder's craft. Day unto day makes known the message. Night unto night pours forth speech. No voice, no word, no sound is heard, yet their proclamation goes forth to the ends of the earth. God placed in them a tent for the sun, who is like a groom coming forth from the chamber, like a hero eager to run his course. His rising place is at one end of heaven, and his circuit reaches to the other. Nothing escapes its heat. To quote from Psalm 19, this is what Ricoeur is talking about, the symbolism of the cosmos that allows there to be, we could say, a hermeneutical dehiscence of interpretation. Again, to use Merleau-Ponty's phrase, this dehiscence of the manifestation of the sacred is able to find a landing into subjective recognition by us human beings through the process of interpretation, meaning making, narration. What Ricoeur means here is that a symbol is bound to the configuration of the cosmos. Ricoeur finds there to be a logic of meaning of the sacred universe, namely a law of correspondences that constitutes this logic of manifestation. One example of such a correspondence cited by Ricoeur is the correspondence between the macrocosm and the microcosm. For example, the hierogamy of earth and sky agrees with the unity and the union of male and female. Many ancient cultures make this kind of connection, that this manifestation of the sacred in terms of the unity of plurality between earth and sky agrees with the union of female and male. And this, we could say, a kind of intersubjectivity, dramatic intersubjectivity of the cosmos is on display in our very anthropology. Another example would be the cyclic movement of celestial bodies reflecting the cyclical processes of life, death, and regeneration. An example of Ricoeur's claim that symbols come to language only to the extent that the elements of the world themselves become transparent would be the symbol of the sun as a bringer of life and light. So the meanings of life and light, all metaphorical meanings of this, relate back to the central cosmological symbol of the sun, not just as some astrological phenomenon, or even chemical phenomenon, something related to biological life, but a phenomenon that generates a host of meanings such as life, light, warmth, goodness, truth. All of these things are related to that primary cosmological symbol of the sun. The sun itself becomes transparent to a meaning that transcends the physical phenomenon of the sun itself, but nevertheless appears through it. The infinite meanings conveyed by the phenomenon of the sun appear insofar as the sun functions as a fertile symbol rather than a frozen idol, what Ricoeur calls a verbal icon. Were the sun to function as an idol, it would refuse to become transparent to the multitude of meanings that its phenomenal appearance engenders. By considering the difference between idol and symbol, Ricoeur begins his exposition on the hermeneutic of proclamation. Again, in his book, Freud and Philosophy, Ricoeur writes, an idol is the reification of the horizon into a thing, the fall of the sign into a supernatural and supracultural object. The idols must die, he says, so that symbols may live. It's a beautiful quote from Ricoeur, and so true. With a reification of the thing, of the object, there's a collapse of this hermeneutical horizon of interpretation and appropriation. And this is why we say with Ricoeur and Marion that the gaze gets frozen vis-a-vis the idol, like looking at the head of Medusa. There's a kind of turning into a pillar of salt, a freezing of interpretation, of self-reflection, of contemplation. It becomes a fetish turned into frozenness, idolatry. Ricoeur notes that in the Hebraic domain, a perpetual struggle obtains between devotion to the one true God, Adonai, Hashem, the name, and the host of idols that assault a monotheistic or at least henotheistic faith. Ricoeur suggests that with the Hebraic faith, the word outweighs the numinous. The instruction through Torah overcomes any manifestation through an image. A theology of name as opposed to any hierophany of an idol. And I think his observations are correct on this point when it comes to Judaism. The preferred primary mode of religious expression is proclamation. Again, word, speech, text, prophecy, witness, Torah, law, instruction, teaching. All of this is how we can think about Judaism phenomenologically. And so to understand Christianity, we first have to understand Judaism, as Christianity is ultimately a reform movement of Judaism, and its roots remain Judaism. So this distinction between the numinous on one hand and manifestation here, and the sense of the sacred here, the sense of divine presence, is contrast for Ricoeur with this primacy of the word, instruction, Torah, name, the sacred name of God, but still a name, and the paradox that for Judaism, it's a name so sacred it's not spoken, but it's still recognized, the tetragrammaton, the YHWH. It's not spoken, but still recognized, signified through the Hebrew letters, the 4 letters, the Yod Het Vav Het, the tetragrammaton. And so Ricoeur says, the fact that God gives humanity a name by which to call him is to say that without this name, we don't recognize God. So thank you for your question. How might this apply to particular places, especially sacred places? Does a place have a primordial essence as sacred outside of creation and humanity, or is it sacred only through human experience? I think this is exactly what Ricoeur is arguing, that there's no sacred apart from the human being that recognizes the sacred as such. So this German phrase als solche, we say in English as such. So your question is about the relationship between the as and the such. The sacred such, does it come into view without the hermeneutical as? For Ricoeur, he's saying no, it doesn't. So places are hallowed by our hermeneutical recognition of this quality of them. So, for example, in the book of Exodus, chapter 3 in the Hebrew scriptures, we have a hierophany or a theophany, God becoming manifest to Moses, and God saying to Moses, remove the sandals on your feet, for this is sacred ground. Every biblical account, there's a hallowing of place because of the event that happens there that involves a human interpreter, a human observer, a human observer become witness through the event, and then the modality of the testimony becomes the hallowing of the place itself, as this happened here. And so there's a memoria, an anamnesis, a remembrance that's kept alive through a traditioning of the originary events that happened there, the encounter between the divine and the human witness. So yes, Ricoeur is saying it's only through human experience that we get a hallowing of a place. You know, we could say a different kind of discourse and worldview, something like that of natural science. Does the sacred appear in natural science? No, it doesn't. Every place is just as good as another. An equality of place, maybe different points of interest depending on the ecosystem or the biological life forms in a given place. And someone might care about the life forms, and so that it may become a special place or something. But we don't get the inbreaking of divinity within the purview of natural science. And so for natural science, physics, all places are equalized and neutralized. One place is the same as another as long as the universal laws of physics apply. But for philosophy, theology, for actual human living, we recognize and make distinctions between places. For example, this is my home, and everywhere else is not. Or this is my home city, my home state, my home country. And we identify with that because there's this uptake of meaning that's coming through interpretation and appropriation of that meaning toward attestation of the meaning in a lived experience. So thank you so much for that question. So Ricoeur gives us this theology of history that elevates the word, becoming opposed to a theology of the sacred that elevates the numinous, the location and material of hierophanic manifestation. Okay, so why this is so a genius discovery by Ricoeur is not only do we see this differential in religious experience, we see it in the history of philosophy itself. We see it in the history of philosophy itself, this distinction between manifestation and proclamation. In terms of phenomenology, and that's what I showcase in this book, the history of phenomenology, we have two schools that have emerged: a phenomenology of manifestation and a phenomenology of proclamation. Manifestation, Edmund Husserl, Martin Heidegger, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Michel Henry, Jean-Luc Marion, most others, Edith Stein, most phenomenologists are part of that manifestation school. But we have something happening out of Heidegger, out of late Heidegger, where there's a cleavage into this hermeneutical turn that's influenced by Wilhelm Dilthey, even as a precursor to Husserl. But this hermeneutical attentiveness carries through into Hans-Georg Gadamer, Paul Ricoeur, Emmanuel Levinas. I can't wait to talk about him later live streams. And Jacques Derrida, people like this who are thinking especially in terms of hermeneutics. And these thinkers tend to have been raised in Judaism and Protestant Christianity, which is very interesting. So the religious milieu shapes the style of thought. And it's perfectly fine and important to come clean about this for philosophy. Every philosopher does his or her philosophizing in a specific location, context. And so Paul Ricoeur has a context, and he's influenced this way. Jean-Luc Marion, as a Catholic, is attentive much more to the sacramentality of Christianity. And this phenomenology of manifestation is a perfect way to explore the phenomenality of sacrament. But for Ricoeur in this Protestant milieu of the predilection for proclamation, we have a desacralizing tendency that wells up and transpires following the mission of proclamation. The mission of proclamation, going back to the prophets, is to smash the idols that obstruct the way to the sacred name Hashem of God. The idol smashing power of the word is unleashed to ward off any possibility of bowing before an idol. This is what we get in this phenomenology of proclamation. We could say theology of proclamation, moreover, philosophy of proclamation. And in Mark Wallace's introduction to Ricoeur, in Ricoeur's book, Figuring the Sacred, He writes, Ricoeur understands revelation, divine revelation, in performative, not propositional terms. It is an event of new meaning between text and interpreter, rather than a body of received doctrines under the control of a particular magisterium. Okay, so he's not a Catholic. Ricoeur refers to the disclosive power of figurative, including sacred texts, as an a-religious sense of revelation. This is Protestant theology at the extreme, with people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a religion without religion kind of motifs. So Ricoeur uses this language too, an a-religious sense of revelation, just insofar as any poetic text, by virtue of its powers of metaphorical reference, can become a world that I inhabit and within which I project my inmost possibilities. Sounds very Heideggerian. And yes, Ricoeur is borrowing a lot from Heidegger here in terms of Dasein and authenticity and one's being in the world. But Ricoeur introduces more than just being toward death that we have in Heidegger, though still attentive to this. So Ricoeur identifies the genius of proclamation within the Judeo-Christian tradition, one filled with various forms of discourse, parabolic, prophetic, ethical, eschatological, poetic, etc. These different forms of discourse that operates according to the logic of limit expressions. So what we get in religious texts for Ricoeur is texts that are grappling with the limit experiences in life, like the book of Job, for example, the question of suffering, involuntary suffering. Why am I going through this? Why did my loved one die? How can I make any sense of all of this? And so we get these parables, these prophecies, these eschatological anticipations or apocalyptic discourse, these ethical discourses, these prescriptive discourses, these legal discourses, these hymnic discourses. We get all these various discourses in sacred texts because we're trying to approach and reflect on these limit experiences in life through limit expressions, even mythological discourse. For philosophy, myth does not mean false at all. Myth is a mode of linguistic expression that is necessary to convey an originary limit experience through a limit expression that we call myth, mythology. It's not just myth, it's mythology. There's a logos within the myth. There's a sense making going on that only the myth can serve as a vehicle of these weighty kinds of meaning. Such discourse, religious discourse, challenges conventional wisdom based on the logic of correspondences alone by a deliberate intensification and transgression of colloquial expressions through the employment of the paradox and the hyperbole, for example. Limit expressions reorient only through the passage of disorientation, rupturing ordinary speech and exploding a once harmonious universe. So the texts intend to do this, these religious texts. They have this impact on us. They disorient us in order to reorient us, ad orientem, around that ultimate absolute divinity, the ultimate meaning and meaningfulness. Limit expressions reorient only through the passage of disorientation. The effect of proclamation's power is a desacralizing of the cosmos, an overturning of values in order to submit a surpassing claim to authenticity and fidelity, to an ultimate concern, to reference the work of Paul Tillich, who's also Protestant, more ultimate than formerly established. Yet for all this, Ricoeur proposes a unified dialectic that harnesses the polarity between manifestation and proclamation in order to promote the unique strengths and contributions of each side of the dialectic, manifestation, proclamation. So even though he puts the accent on proclamation, he still is very attentive to what's going on with this phenomenality of manifestation and how the manifestation comes to surface through the Hermeneutics of Proclamation. Ricoeur suggests that this dialectic provides a healing balm for the growing and pervasive secularization of culture, as well as for the hypersensitivity to the holy that can distort and idolize the natural symbolic display of the cosmos. For instance, while a thinker like Sigmund Freud may be regarded as a Goliath of modernity for religious faith, threatening the very existence and legitimacy of religious faith, Ricoeur finds the Manifestation Proclamation dialectic to be an intervening mediator between the reasonable accusations posed by Freud and the distortions that obtain within his method of psychoanalysis that presupposes a philosophy. So again, in his book, Freud and Philosophy, Ricoeur writes, the fact that a destructive hermeneutics is justified according to the requirements of faith itself does not imply an acceptance in toto of the psychoanalysis of religion within the framework outlined by Freud. On the contrary, we must once more come to grips with Freud. We must confront his hermeneutics with the hermeneutics of Mircea Eliade, van der Leuve, Barthes, Boltzmann, in order to construct what we can say positively and negatively about the psychoanalysis of religion. So it's interesting in this litany of people that Ricoeur refers to here, we have both representatives of the manifestation philosophy of religion and the proclamation philosophy of religion. Eliade, van der Leuve are manifestation, and Karl Barth, Rudolf Bultmann, representatives of the proclamation tradition. And so when we bring these two things together in this dialectic, what we have here is a hermeneutical device to call out and unmask every reductionism in thoughts, no matter what field of study. What Ricoeur is saying, going back to the figure of the ellipse, the ellipsis, two foci, two nuclei, the need to dialogue, the need to think further than some few good ideas. There's other ones besides. And the commitment to think toward the whole that's only possible through this discourse of the universe, the discourse between interlocutors, and moving toward an interpretation of the whole that does not reduce the whole to one or some of its many parts. So Freud has a place within the whole, but a slice of the whole. Freudian psychoanalysis is not the whole and does not give us the whole. There's some lacunae, there's some deficiencies, there's some blind spots that can be brought into light, that can be unmasked. Sometimes things need to be deconstructed. We think of the work of Jacques Derrida here in order to stretch the hermeneutic, the 0 point of orientation of the interpretation of things. So this is very important. And Ricoeur's philosophy brings us back to this commitment to the whole. So we think then about, despite Ricoeur's attempt to adhere to a balanced and complementary dialectic, Ricoeur definitely privileges one side of the dialectic of manifestation and proclamation over the other. He assigns the primacy to proclamation. And this claim is suggested in light of the whole of Ricoeur's writing on the subject. So while Ricoeur will write that the subtle equilibrium between the iconoclastic virtualities of proclamation and the symbolic resurgence of the sacred has expressed itself through the history of Christianity as a dialectic of preaching and sacraments, it is telling to note that he refrains from referring to the sacramentality of the cosmos in his assessment of the phenomenology of the sacred. In fact, Ricoeur appears to collapse sacrament into kerygma. As he says, the sacrament, we could say, is the mutation of sacred ritual into the kerygmatic realm. So that kind of definition of sacrament would not hold in a Catholic concept or Orthodox Christian concept of the term. There's something irreducible about the manifestation of the sacred that we want to think along with Jean-Luc Marion about that more in his phenomenology of givenness. So as much as I appreciate Ricoeur's thought and very much enjoy getting into his thought, learn so much from his thought. I don't endorse it like wholesale myself. I see it related again to many other thinkers that round out the picture, the big picture, the thinking toward the whole. Yet there is more. Ricoeur writes, quote, "For in Christianity, the liturgical kernel represents the Eucharist as a kind of text that tells the story of the Last Supper," end quote. So for Ricoeur, the Eucharist, for example, which we would consider a sacrament within Christianity, is not so much a matter of a manifestation of presence as it is an instance of textual proclamation. And that's the Protestant understanding of the meaning of Eucharist, going back to Luther and Zwingli and Calvin and all the Protestant reformers. If there's still any concept of Eucharist at all within the tradition of Reform, it's a textual one, a narrative one, not really a sacramental one that we have in Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. So Ricoeur concedes that this liturgical text that tells the story of the Last Supper in the last resort does refer to a sacred act, and that he recognizes something revealing that is not frozen in any ultimate or immutable text. But Ricoeur makes this concession reluctantly. And this is a key line from Ricoeur. Ricoeur says, "I am frightened by this word sacred. I am frightened by this word sacred." Levinas will say the same thing. Why? Why are they frightened about it as these philosophers of proclamation? Because, not just because the sacred is different than text or word or speech or prophecy or ethics, but because of the potential for the sacred to become irrational and unethical. And this is what we have in Nazi Germany. So, yes, we should all fear the word sacred, the sense of the sacred, the concept of the sacred, not just as sacred, but what it can do, what human beings can end up doing in the name of the sacred, sacrificing the rationality and the ethical commitment of responsibility for the other human person who faces me. So this is big stuff for philosophy, because within the terrain of the human experience, we see this everywhere. We see extremist movements in every religious tradition. We see extremes taken within political positions we call ideology. And we get all this energy and enthusiasm, a kind of charismatic existence orbiting around some concept of the sacred, with the idea that whatever direction the sacred goes, I go with it, whether it's rational or not. And that's a dangerous place to be. And philosophy calls us back to this place of resistance of the irrational. We resist the irrational in many forms. It doesn't mean we're rationalists. It doesn't mean we drift into rationalism, because I would argue, I argue in this book and many other places, that it's more rational to be open to divinity and the revelation of divinity than to close off to it. But for this reason, divinity, from a philosophical point of view, is not something or someone that is going to contradict reason, since reason proceeds from divinity. And this is the concept of logos in Greek philosophy that we get through the Judeo-Christian tradition for sure, and I think in degrees in all the religious traditions of the world. It is this human commitment, again, to deal with our limit experiences with courage through limit expressions. But as we express the experience, to make meaning from one person to another, we have to adhere to the anchor of the logos that makes what we say logical, rational, intelligible, a coherence of meaning. And so the logos principle is what governs the making of meaning and the communicating of meaning, well, given our collective religious experiences. So Ricoeur is he's frightened by the word sacred. And so he says, in the end, Christianity proceeds from a proclamation. It begins with the fundamental preaching that maintains that in Jesus Christ, the kingdom has approached us in decisive fashion. So for Christianity, yes. So it's in his attention to language, interpretation, and proclamation that allows Ricoeur to prioritize testimony as constitutive of ethics, that movement from manifestation to meaning to appropriation to attestation, and the attestation of the ethical. And in future live streams, that's where I want to turn my attention to Ricoeur, not only understanding the phenomenon as es gibt alles, but es gibt nach, understanding the ethics of phenomenality. So I'll close here in this live stream, unless there's more questions. I'm happy to entertain any questions here. But for Ricoeur, again, there's a movement from the phenomenology of es gibt, which is givenness. Husserl's concept of givenness, he's using the term. Es gibt, literally, it gives. What gives? The phenomenon gives. The phenomenon gives itself by itself, as itself, to an interpreter, to a human subject, to conscious subjectivity. Okay, so it gives. Ricoeur expands this notion to es gibt alles. This is what we've been talking about the past few live streams. Not just it gives, pre-verbally, non-linguistically, but it gives verbally and linguistically through the phenomenological as. It gives as. The next step we want to take with Ricoeur to finish out, at least for now, the analysis of Ricoeur in some probably one or two upcoming live streams, is the movement toward, through the es gibt alles, the es gibt nach, which we would say in English, it gives according to, ellipsis, according to who? The witness. So we have a phenomenon giving itself to an ego, subjectivity. But Ricoeur says we don't have a naked, mute givenness. If we recognize it as such, it's because of the as. It's because we have meaning to add to manifestation. And moreover, we receive phenomena as human beings within a cloud of witnesses in the communities in which we live, the families in which we live and grow up. And so it doesn't give just as to an I, but according to all of these witnesses in a symbolic order of interpretation, and a really a kind of being enmeshed in a community of interpreters. So the according to is going to be very pivotal to make the movement from the event of manifestation to the event of meaning to the event of appropriation of meaning become attestation. Attestation in the witness, where the ego is not just a neutral observer in the world, but the ego is made witness by the original alterity of the phenomenon and the meaning generated by the givenness of the phenomenon. So Ricoeur takes us through this whole process of interpretation, which is the only way that truth lights up for a person. Truth does not just happen here. Even the word truth implies a meaning already as it es gibt alles. What do we mean by truth? And this truth that circulates, that wants to mean more and more within this field of interpretation, this fray of interpretation, this contest for the veracity of truth, the clarity of truth. So we have this process. This is Paul Ricoeur. So much to learn from him, to think responsibly and ethically in the end. This is what is lacking in Husserl, Heidegger, and Marion, not to develop ethical philosophy. So we need to look to those philosophers of ethics like Ricoeur, and I would say above all Levinas within the history of phenomenology, to get at these points. Thank you for your question, Imran. Could I contrast religious idols with religious iconography, text, and symbols? Do idols pose a problem similar to the sacred in terms of foreclosing rational reappropriation and proclamation? Yes. So Ricoeur, like he said, he's frightened by the word sacred because he's also afraid that any notion of the sacred will quickly become an idol. And we see this in human behavior. When I used to work in full-time ministry in the Catholic Church, I saw this directly up close and in person with pastors in the church, with colleagues, and you get this territorial phenomenon where people are manipulating the sacred to reinforce their own power. Not in every case, but it does happen with some high degree of frequency, not just in Catholicism or Christianity, but in religious traditions around the world. So proclamation helps to it brings about the distanciation between personal power and public access to the sacred. So this is very interesting things here. For example, the phenomenon of clericalism is based on a manipulation of the sacred by someone who has power in the community, and they manipulate the sacred to reinforce their power. This is a very real thing. I've experienced it countless times, sadly, and I'm still Catholic. Because of all of this truth, in any case, and faith involved in that. But so what can happen is the slippage into idolatry of the sacred, and idolatry of the sacred involves a manipulation of the sacred out of one's own self-interests. So the sacred becomes idol vis-a-vis self-interest of the worshiper and the manipulator of the sacred. Whereas there's meant to be an iconicity of the sacred, or as you say, an iconography of the sacred. And I like how you put that, because not just icon, but the graphos, the writing of the sacred through text and symbol that prevents the sacred to be an irrational force that can oppress people, that can rob people of their personal freedom. And so in Protestant Christianity, Martin Luther, his work, The Freedom of Being a Christian, he's really levying a very hard critique and a manipulation of the sacred in Catholicism of his time in the 16th century. And it results in an understanding of freedom, though, at the other extreme of things. Now, proclamation without the sacred becomes a heightened individualism and very arbitrary will to power, to reference Nietzsche there too, in terms of the sacred. So you can get, the prosperity gospel, for example, or what the sociologist Max Weber calls the Protestant work ethic. When you have a desacralization process that ends up in secularity, secularism, with no anchor in the prerogatives and even the priority of the sacred. So in contemporary culture, in the United States, for example, there's a great fallacy, and that is people want to be free, and they seek liberation from the sacred, and it becomes the secular metropolis. And this is what we see across culture, the rise of secularism, of practical atheism, because people don't trust the sacred ultimately, and regard divinity as kind of take it or leave it. And so when we have this distanciation of the sacred without departure from the sacred, this is Ricoeur, really. It's a distanciation, but it's not a closure of the sacred. In the most extreme forms of Protestant Christianity, extreme reform, we have less and less detectability of the sacred per se. Everything is very um, um, yeah, secularized, and there's no priesthood, there's no sacraments, there's no iconography, there's no religious symbols, there's no crucifix. We see that. So this book is narrating these differences within the Judeo-Christian tradition, but also the history of phenomenology that helps us to get at this. So I really appreciate that question, and it's a dialectical philosophy. We don't want to throw out all the kernels with the husk. We need to peel back the husk to get at the kernels, but still maintain the kernels therein. So this is why we put all these philosophers together, to help us get more clarity without sacrificing essential parts of the whole. So that's incredibly important, and it's important to maintain rationality, but not the idolatry of rationality either. So the key word is and, the conjunction and this, and that, and the other thing within philosophy. So there is the sacred and iconography, text, symbol, interpretation, appropriation, attestation, and back to the sacred, and ethics, and politics, and natural science, and interdisciplinary thinking. It's a tall order, big responsibility. But someone like Ricoeur gives us confidence that we at least can remain in the contest and not settle for a kind of fatigued reductionism in our thinking. And so many doctrines, whether sacred or secular, can involve reductionism, and we want to avoid that. Phenomenology is a method that allows us to keep guard against reductionism, to prevent the collapse of thought into just more of the same. Philosophy, I'd say true philosophy, is always on the lookout for a new interlocutor, a new partner of dialogue to stretch the thinking more. Not in a trivial sense, but in a sincere, sincere yet disinterested desire toward this collective movement to truth. So thank you again, Imam, for this great question. And another one thinks, is it possible to avoid reducing sacraments to the discursive for Ricoeur? To some degree, yeah. I think, he still mentions sacrament. You have some thinkers that just don't even use the language. And some thinkers, like Levinas, who's not Christian, won't talk about the sacraments and his own thought, only vis-a-vis Christianity, but it doesn't really play in his own thought, which is Jewish. But for Ricoeur, as Christian, there's still some sense of the sacrament, but it's always in the tenor of proclamation in the end. We don't have a pure manifestation of the sacrament with Ricoeur, because he would say, with no hermeneutics, with no discourse about the sacrament, it doesn't land in conscious subjectivity. So we need the word, and for the Protestant Christianity, scripture is primary, sacrament, if there is mention of sacrament, is secondary. So I think there is a sacramental kernel still with Ricoeur, but it is not reachable without discourse, without interpretation, without what we would call the liturgy of the word. In Christianity, there's no getting at the liturgy of the sacrament. Whereas for Catholicism, for Eastern Orthodox Christianity, that are driven much more by a phenomenology of manifestation, we might question, do they ever get far enough into proclamation? So both of these things we have with Ricoeur. And in this book, I guess what I was attempting to do is not cash out with Ricoeur alone, with Marion alone, with Levinas alone, but to bring these three thinkers together and to cash out with all of them together. What does that do for phenomenology of religious experience when our hermeneutics is built by multiple pillars and not just one or even two? But when we have a trialectic that opens up beyond a dialectic, and it's a play on words because dia doesn't mean two, it means through, but tri will mean three. So it implies the dialectic begins with the polarity and distinction of the two in the ellipsis form. But when you have a distinction of the two that's maintained, we have a fruit that is born, that is generated from the two, like in human sexuality, for example. The opposites that attract result in a paideia, a fruit, an offspring, a fertility, a fecundity of that living dialectic that maintains a unity and plurality. Thanks so much, Michael, for recommending the channel to friends involved in theology and philosophy. Yeah, we try to go deep into explanations and background in biochemistry that's able to understand. And that's a fascinating conversation too. I was once studying pre-medicine in undergrad and wanted to become a medical doctor and took this long route. As Ricoeur would talk about it, I got into music and then ministry, then philosophy and theology. And so here I am at this stage in my life, just instead of playing the trumpet like I used to do, involved in philosophizing and theologizing, and just feeling very moved to do so. So I think these interdisciplinary conversations between something like biology, chemistry, biochemistry, and philosophy and theology are very important in our time, because another thing that's part of the, like we could say, secular doctrine is that faith and science can't be unified. And it's just simply not true. It's non-philosophical to say that. It's irrational to say that, because in philosophy, we investigate it all. We investigated it all, at least in terms of anthropology, lived experience, and all of that is fair game for philosophy. So it's a sad day when we're not able to dialogue as human beings about our common lived experiences, when we have a kind of indoctrination of secularism, in which there's no room to refer to divinity or religious tradition as if that's going to result in violence or extremism. The way it doesn't is that we're able to dialogue about it all. When we don't dialogue, the next line of communication is violence, is a way of communicating that says something through a body language of impact, and that is destructive. So thanks for your question, Michael. Where to begin reading Ricoeur? And you write you're into language and philosophy. Some of the books that I've been mentioning here, so on these live streams lately, I'm just kind of commenting in this 2017 book of mine, Dialectical Anatomy of the Eucharist, where I spend the most time writing about Ricoeur and synthesizing his thought. And so in the bibliography of this book, there's many good sources, many that I've been mentioning along the way. And if I think back to, as I was studying his thought, what were some of the more helpful essays getting into it? There's this one I mentioned that it's called Interpretation Theory, Discourse and the Surplus of Meaning, a 1976 text of Ricoeur. I think that's a helpful one. It's not too long, and it's a good entry into simply that interpretation theory, so the philosophy of interpretation. If you want to get more into his philosophy of well, one I think you would like too is this book of his Hermeneutics and the Human Sciences, Essays on Language, Action, and Interpretation. So those two books of Ricoeur, very good points of entry. But if you want more what he has to say about things religious, I would say his book Figuring the Sacred, subtitled Religion, Narrative, and Imagination. Also, the book, The Conflict of Interpretations that I mentioned, subtitled Essays in Hermeneutics, is also good for hermeneutics in general, but it does get into some things religious. So those few books, yeah, those few books I would recommend. And thanks, yeah, for highlighting my own book. I don't hold this up all the time as a sales pitch, but just if you're following along with my live streams, that you might want to follow along with my original text. That's a lot more in here than what I'm able to say in the live streams. So yeah, hopefully maybe my stream's a little delayed too, but if you watch this video again, I mentioned several texts, Ricoeur's books, Interpretation Theory, Hermeneutics and the Human Sciences, The Conflict of Interpretation, and then in things religious, Figuring the Sacred is a good one there. Great. Yeah, so any other questions for today? I'm happy to entertain them. Thank you all so much for joining me. It really means a whole lot. I'm glad you're appreciating these live streams, enjoying them. And I hope to keep making more. And I try to do it like Monday through Friday and take the weekend off as a break. Maybe some Saturdays I might do one, but otherwise, this is a new venue, I think, for teaching and learning. And I love both. I love to teach, I love to learn, and that we can have a dialogue, through the chat, through the comment section after videos are posted, this ongoing interaction. And the prize is truth, is seeking the truth and doing that together. But we do so in neither a fundamentalist way nor a relativistic way. And I talk about that in this book. It's truth is in the via media of its manifestation and meaning. We avoid extremes. We avoid extreme interpretations in order to let truth show itself in a rational, balanced, and holistic way. As Joseph Ratzinger has said, truth is the whole. Is that not true? Is that not the truth about truth? It's the whole. And yes, the whole is saturating. No one can comprehend even a decent fraction of it in a thought. But we continue to think step by step, surveying the landscape of truth together and tour together, letting truth itself be the guide and its interpreters be its witnesses. So thank you for joining me today, everyone. I encourage you to continue to think toward the whole, to pray from the heart, and to live as a witness. We'll see you in the next one.